In some of my videos, I've mentioned that I don't think it's necessary to have formal documentation or follow a formal procedure in all cases. And in fact, in some cases, this isn't a neutral act, but it can have a negative impact on the employment relationship. In today's video, I'm going to be discussing which formalities in the employment relationship are necessary and which are not. Welcome back, or just welcome if you're new here. I'm Common Free. I'm an employment relations practitioner, and I'm also the director and owner of Free Employment Relations. I've included a list of my credentials in the description box below to give you some peace of mind around the content that I share. My disclaimer for today's video is my usual disclaimer. I share a lot of information, but I'm not able to cover every exception or every nuance in these videos. Therefore, these videos are for educational purposes only. Please contact a professional if you need assistance. Today's video is about formalization in business. This is the extent to which you put things on paper, the extent to which you have formal structures in place and specific formal procedures for how you go about things. We can rank formalization from low, moderate to high. Low meaning you have very few written rules, you have very few structures in place, and you deal with things on a very ad hoc case-to-case basis. With moderate formalization, there will be a few written down rules. You'll probably have some contracts in place, maybe some other type of documentation in place, and potentially even a structured disciplinary process. When we speak about highly formalized, we're speaking about incredibly structured. This is often described as a very legalistic environment. There will be many rules, and so much that governs the employment relationship will be written down. There will be a lot of documentation. Now, with formalization, it's not one size fits all. It's not low is bad, high is good at all. When we discuss the level of formalization in a company, there's another variable that we need to take into account, and that is the trust in the employment relationship. The trust will often impact the amount of formalization that is necessary, but also the amount of formalization that happens in a business will impact on the trust in the employment relationship. Now, when we speak about the trust in the employment relationship, what we're discussing here is the trust between the employees and leadership. Where we have high levels of trust, you'll typically find lower levels of formalities. Where we have low levels of trust, there will typically need to be a higher level of formalization. When dealing with the employment relationship, these are things that can shift over time. So you will need to increase or decrease your formalities as things change in your business. Now, before you tell me, oh, but I trust all my employees, yet I still want a formal policy in place for X, Y, and Z. I'm going to cover nuances in this video to give a better perspective on the level of formalization that is necessary in a business, or how the level of formalization impacts on the employment relationship. But bear in mind here that trust is something that is two ways. Just because you trust your employees does not mean that your employees trust leadership. Something else that also happens in businesses is when businesses grow, particularly in terms of number of employees, or be it in terms of their geographic spread, as your business is growing, the trust will naturally decrease. Now, this is not a bad thing. It is just a natural byproduct of a business increasing, because the larger your business is, as a leader, you are not able to have the strong one-on-one relationship that you previously had with your employees. Now, as the business grows, especially in terms of number of employees, a leader will need to be able to balance the management of the collective employment relationship. So that is to speak about managing your employees as a whole, while balancing that with the individual one-on-one relationship that you have with personal employees. In my experience, this is typically where small businesses hit some bumps. Because when they're small, when they're starting out, there's very strong one-on-one relationships between leadership and the employees. And then often a small business will grow at a rapid rate, and that's great. But the focus as a business is growing is then often on the output, the production, keeping up with that growth, which then means that sometimes it goes unnoticed that there's been inherent changes in the employment relationship with the growth of the business. So as a business grows and the other areas of business need to catch up and to be able to sustain that growth, the employment relationship also needs to change. And that leads me to tip number 1 when it comes to formalization. Start first with the bare minimum formalities that you need to have in place. Don't try to bring in a library of policies and documentation and formal structures from the get-go. First of all, doing that is usually quite expensive, and it is very time-consuming as well to sit down and to have all the information, even if you're working with an employment relations practitioner, to get that information to be able to draft the documentation and to structure those formal procedures. And then more than that, it's incredibly overwhelming when businesses take this approach for leadership and for the employees. When we bring in a whole library of policies and procedures and structures, what often happens is you implement them and then everybody forgets about them. Your policies, your documentation, it sits on a shelf because there was too much at the same time. When I start to work with businesses, what I do is I come in and I assess the current climate of the business in terms of the number of employees, how things work, etc. And I also have a look at what documentation they currently have in place. Then we start to see what needs to be removed, updated, or changed for us to lay a very strong foundation for the employment relationship, starting with the bare minimum documentation and procedures that need to be in place. The assumption going into it is that we need to lay a foundation of documentation and procedures that are adaptable and flexible and are easy to grow and change as the business grows and changes. The documentation and procedures need to be useful now, but they also need to bear in mind where the business is going in the future. Let me give you a practical example. In my career as an employment relations practitioner, I have read a crazy number of employment contracts. Sometimes I have read many contracts in one company alone, because what happens is through the years, the company has undergone some changes, so they updated their contracts or they changed their contracts. Or through the years, they worked with different employment relations companies who all felt the need to take their employment contract and get the business to use that contract instead. Depending on how the contract is drafted, then what we will sometimes see as time goes on, that the contracts become inaccurate in terms of an accurate representation of what is going on in the business. So when I draft a contract of employment, I stick to things that can be standardized as far as possible. I stick predominantly to the terms and conditions of employment. Now that might seem obvious. A contract is usually for the terms and conditions of employment. However, that's not what happens in practice a lot of the time. In practice, what happens a lot of the time is that other expectations around the employment relationship get put into the contract. And if this additional information is highly susceptible to change as the business goes on, then the contract can very quickly become inaccurate in terms of representing what's happening in the employment relationship and therefore need to be redone every couple of years. So what I try to do is draft a contract where we include the things that are not typically subject to change. And things that do change quite frequently, I will draft on additional documentation such that we don't need to constantly be changing the contract of employment. To give an example of why it's not a good idea to constantly be having your contracts changed. And of course, if they are inaccurate in terms of what's happening in the relationship, or they're not good contracts, or there are some parts of it that's not compliant with the legislation, then yes, they need to be updated, but we want to be drafting them in a way that avoids that. Now, if you are constantly having to update your contracts, I'll give an example of a case that I had where the contract was updated so many times that when there was a dispute and we went to the CCMA, we need to present documentation. And there were some questions around terms and conditions that came up, which means we need to discuss the contract of employment and the behaviors in the relationship. There were so many different versions of the contract that it was hard to tell which one was in effect at the time the dispute arose. There were also additional documentation policies that were contrary to what's in the contract of employment, plus some emails that overrode other things that happened, and it made the dispute incredibly messy. This is an example of unnecessary conflict, or conflict that has grown unnecessarily because we created confusion, misperception, and misunderstandings with the documentation that was in place. Now, that being said, the first document that I believe should be in place for all employment relationships, so this is not just businesses, this also includes individuals who hire domestic help, is a contract of employment. The reason I'm saying there needs to be a contract of employment is not because of a lack of trust, but rather because of the complexity of the labor legislation. The labor legislation dictates a lot of what the parties can expect from each other and what their entitlements are. An employment contract will detail a lot of those expectations and will detail the terms and conditions that are typically governed by the legislation. Things like your working hours, how overtime pay works, if that's applicable, Sunday pay, night work, and also the different types of leave and how payment works. I don't think it's necessary to have a very long contract, a very detailed contract, and the type of contract can be altered to suit the type of relationship. That being said, there is some minimum information in terms of the legislation that needs to be written down in the employment employment relationship, and how we typically do that is a contract of employment. Moving on to a document I do not think is necessary in an employment relationship, and that is a leave policy. In my experience, I've seen contracts of employment that have no details about the leave. They'll just have the heading and say, see leave policy. Or they will have some information about the leave in the contract, but also have a leave policy. And in many cases, the leave policy and the contract have contradictory information. Most businesses do not benefit from a leave policy, and in most businesses, it creates unnecessary confusion. Documentation in the employment relationship is to avoid having confusion and to provide clarification. The exception to what I'm discussing here is often very, very large corporate businesses that have leave entitlements that are different from the legislation, like different types of leave entitlements, and specific information around how employees can become entitled to this leave, or if they want to take the leave, what do they need to do to be entitled to it. So this is leave that's up and above the typical annual leave, family responsibility leave, sick leave, maternity leave, and the others detailed in the Basic Conditions of Employment Act. Contracts of employment draft the terms and conditions, so the leave that employees are entitled to. Typically, we use policies to provide additional information. That's usually if there's a very company-specific procedure employees need to follow to be entitled to the leave, or if there's other information where we've had recurring issues come up that require clarification. It isn't a default that a business large in size needs to have a leave policy. Another exception to this, and you can have a look at my sick leave video or my template that I've linked down below for a sick leave policy, and this is if we're having a recurring issue regarding medical certificates that are accepted by the business or not accepted by the business. This policy should not be a standard in all businesses. It should only be in businesses that have a risk of unnecessary conflict around medical certificates, and businesses that have specific requirements around medical certificates in order to accept them to pay out sick leave. The contract of employment will then detail the entitlement to sick leave, and the leave policy or the medical certificate policy will detail information around how to be entitled to that sick leave in terms of what medical certificates are accepted and what medical certificates are not accepted. So the what is detailed in the contract, but the how is detailed in a policy. For the average business, there is not a lot of complexities around how employees become entitled to leave. So there might be a little bit of information around that in the contract of employment if there's nothing out of the ordinary. That's typically what I draft in my contracts of employment, like for example, how long in advance we expect employees to apply for annual leave, or when a medical certificate will be required from them in order to claim paid sick leave. What is sufficient in most businesses is my leave application template that I've linked down below. This is a one-page document that businesses and employees use to apply for leave and to document the leave an employee has taken. It has all the different types of leave and other information that is necessary for record-keeping purposes. It's a one-pager that complements a basic contract of employment, and that is more than sufficient in most businesses. Another document that I recommend that all businesses and all individuals to the employment relationship have in place is a payslip, sometimes also referred to as a paysub. Section 33 of the Basic Conditions of Employment details specific information around remuneration that employees need to receive every time they receive a payment. The best and easiest way to do this is in the form of a payslip. If you do not have a Basic Conditions of Employment Act handy with you right now, I've provided a link down below to what information an employer is expected to give an employee every time they receive payment in terms of Section 33 of the Basic Conditions of Employment. Not only is it important to have a payslip, but it is important to issue the payslip to an employee every single month or whenever you are paying them. So if you're paying somebody on a weekly basis or fortnightly basis, you need to issue them with a payslip on a weekly or fortnightly basis. I do not recommend being the employer where employees need to be requesting their payslip from you. Ensure that you provide an employee with a payslip every time you make a payment to them. I understand that business owners and leaders are very busy, so my recommendation here is either invest in software that you use to calculate the remuneration you're paying out to your employees, keep record of what is being owed to them, what is paid, what are they still entitled to in terms of leave or other outstanding payments, and then use a software that generates an accurate, compliant payslip. Then issue that to an employee. Alternatively to doing it yourself through a software is to use a bookkeeper who provides the services or a payroll consultant. Ensure that whoever you decide to use for this service is reliable and does issue the payslips on the day that the payment is made. A good way to issue it to most employees this is to have the PDF document and email it to the employees if you have a company-wide software where they can access that information and download that information. That's another way to do it. Or you can also have the PDF and send it via WhatsApp to your employees. If your employee would prefer a printed out version or does not have access to technology where a PDF is appropriate, then please print it out for them. Another big tip I have here is to explain the payslip to all employees. My recommendation is when an employee starts working for you as part of their onboarding process or the first time they receive a payment, go through the payslip with them. Even if you think that it's obvious, just take the little bit of time it requires to go through this. The reason I recommend this is one of the services that I've often provided to companies is going in and de-escalating a situation that has become a little bit destructive. And how I de-escalate the situation is by going over the payslip in a lot of detail and listening to any misunderstandings that the employee has had regarding that information or clearing up any kind of errors that was in the payslip. And a lot of the time, the reason I'm called in for this is that employees as an individual or as a collective go a really long time not understanding their payslip or having misperceptions around their payslip. And you can very easily say, oh, well, they should have told me and then we would have clarified it. Yes, but we don't live in an ideal world. And often people are very uncomfortable talking about their payslip or talking about money. And maybe they also don't realize that they're reading it incorrectly. You can mitigate a lot of unnecessary conflict by having a payslip that is clear, accurate, easy to understand, and compliant with the legislation. Issue it on time and reliably, and take the little bit of time necessary to explain to an employee. Moving on to a document I do not think is necessary in most businesses, and this one might come as a surprise. It is a code of conduct. I often get people contact me wanting to buy my code of conduct or disciplinary code of conduct. I don't have one and I haven't drafted one in years. This is because I don't think it's necessary for most businesses, and I don't think they add value. There's a lot of recommendations I have around how I think discipline should be approached in the employment relationship, but having a code of conduct or a typical disciplinary code is not one of them. And why is this? A disciplinary code of conduct is a very bulky, very rigid document. Where we will typically see it being used is in a high formalization, low trust company. We will see both parties in the employment relationship using this document against each other. What I typically experience is that they will nitpick sentences rather than acting from a place of fairness and consistency while allowing for the flexibility to make adaptations that are necessary to fairly handle things on a case-by-case basis. In many cases, a company might also have a disciplinary code of conduct that nobody looks at, nobody reads, and is not accurate in terms of what is actually happening in the employment relationship until such time as there's a dispute, and then they'll pull it out to use it against each other. A time where I do think a disciplinary code of conduct may be a useful document is in a company that's going to follow that disciplinary code of conduct to the T. And this we often see in highly unionized companies. That's to say there needs to be a lot of focus on how we manage the collective employment relationship. And I'm not talking about a company that has one union. Usually, this is in companies that have 3 or 4 unions in the company. To be able to manage that effectively, they will have a disciplinary code of conduct whereby they detail very specific things around the timeframes for disciplinary hearings, who will typically chair a disciplinary hearing, who's present in the disciplinary hearing, if there's evidence that needs to be presented or witnesses, how this needs to happen in the disciplinary hearing or before the hearing. It will also have information around types of warnings, when these warnings are issued, and the appeal and grievance process. Like I said, you'll find this in low trust, high formalization businesses. With a low trust business, we typically find that employees do not trust leadership and therefore they would like to turn to a union for support. And the similar thing we see happen on the leadership side, on management side. Management often will not feel comfortable to deal with situations that arise. They will often have external support as well in the form of an employment relations practitioner or a lawyer on retainer, or often these businesses do have an employment relations practitioner in-house. The manager will not handle any situation that could be a dispute or potential dispute or already is a dispute, but rather they will get an employment relations practitioner involved, and the same thing with an employee. They won't handle it directly with management. They will turn to their union for that support. The companies that I've worked with do this because I'm an external employment relations practitioner. They will typically have their their internal HR or internal employment relations person draft the code of conduct or the disciplinary code of conduct for the business, and that person will have all the information around how to ensure that everybody stays within the bounds of that document. I will come in and give advice on a particular situation, or most of the time my services was to come in, to chair the hearing, to write up my recommendation, and to issue that to the company. The in-house employment relations person usually sits in on all of the hearings, and as I'm going through the procedure, if there is anything that is very company specific or a time frame that they have, that in-house person will ensure that I'm aware of what that is. They also will typically give me their code of conduct upfront so that I know if they have anything specific regarding disciplinary process, evidence, or how quickly I need to give the outcome once I've chaired the hearing. But they'll also have an internal person to ensure that there's compliance with that. As you may expect, this is not your average business, and therefore I do not believe your average business needs to have a disciplinary code of conduct. What I recommend for most businesses, for the average business, is to have the basic documentation for discipline in place, and this is usually a guide simply for your managers, not a code of conduct that regulates both managers and employees. Very basic written rules and templates for issuing sanctions, and templates to guide managers to ensure that they implement effective and fair disciplinary action. I can make a video that will go into a lot more detail around what I recommend for most businesses around disciplinary documentation and formal procedures. Let me just provide a shorter version and some general tips in this video. My first tip is, if your business is very small, have only one person issue disciplinary action. Have the important templates on hand for standardization. I've linked down below my warning templates. The other important thing is the wording that you use on issuing notices. I've also linked down below a guide that I drafted that I would recommend for most businesses. The reason I'm recommending the documentation that I've drafted is because I believe that that documentation is useful to most businesses. I also have videos on my channel around various elements of ensuring fair disciplinary action. A small business that only issues warnings every now and again will just need to have the basics in place. One of the changes, and again, I spoke of how we want to implement documentation that can be built on. So one of the changes that I would recommend as a business grows is what you'll typically experience is that different leaders are going to start implementing disciplinary action. And it's not just going to be one person issuing that disciplinary action. And that's a good thing. We want leaders to be empowered to take disciplinary action. But by empowered, what I mean is we want to ensure that they do it in a fair and effective manner. So the recommendation I have to then increase the documentation you have in place is, I've linked it down below. It is a disciplinary guide for leaders. It has a list of offenses and what my typical recommended sanction is. You can adapt this to suit your business, but what you want from this document, you want to ensure that you're acting consistently across the different leaders who are issuing disciplinary action, because consistency is a requirement for fairness, and fairness here being used to say that that's a legislative requirement. And you also want your leaders to feel empowered, that they know when something is severe enough that they need to escalate it higher, or you might need to get in an external person to help you deal with that. This document helps businesses to feel empowered to do a lot of the disciplinary stuff on their own, because one of the things that is not necessary in terms of formalization is to always use an external employment relations practitioner. You want to be equipping your leaders to do this on their own when it is appropriate to do so. In most small businesses, your rules do not need to be written down. The exception to this is if you have a very unique rule to your business that you feel is necessary to have down on paper and not just be explained to employees when they start the business, because the fairness requirement of the legislation is not whether a rule is written down or not. It's whether the employee was aware of the rule or could reasonably be expected to be aware of the rule. When we write down rules, it's because we're having a recurring issue related to it, and the issue comes not from something else, but it comes from confusion around that rule. So we use documentation to clarify as a way to try to avoid the recurring issue. One of the documents that I do recommend that many businesses have in place when it comes to writing down rules is if a business has a driver. That is to say, if a business has somebody who drives the company vehicle, I highly recommend that businesses have a driver policy policy that you go through with the driver in terms of expectations around how to handle various scenarios and specific rules on how the driver is expected to carry out their job while ensuring that they use the company's vehicle appropriately. This, in my experience, avoids a lot of conflict in the employment relationship when a company has a driver. But then it wouldn't be a general code of conduct. It's a specific document that is not given to all employees. It's given to somebody who is a driver for the company or who, as part of their job, performs driving duties. Let's move on to something that I would like the parties to the employment relationship to consider when it comes to formalization. Yes, formalization and documentation can be very helpful and in some cases very necessary and add a lot of value to the employment relationship. But what I want to caution against doing is when the parties to the employment relationship avoid the discomfort of an interpersonal relationship by defaulting to the documentation rather than speaking in terms of themselves. I'll give an example of how this plays out. You'll have something like an employee does something and then the manager will go up to them and say, rule number 5 says you're not allowed to do that, so you need to stop doing that. They might even add, if you continue to do this, then this, and this will happen to you as per the rule. This is not good communication. What we would prefer to see is a leader or a manager speaking to the specific person about their specific behavior and explaining to them why this behavior is against the rules of the business or not allowed in the business. Rule number 5 says you're not allowed to do that thing, therefore you shouldn't do it. To me is the equivalent of a parent saying to a child, you shouldn't do that thing or you should do this because I told you so. This does not lead to meaningful changes in behavior. It is an effective leadership and it is the use of power or authority to get somebody to do what you want them to do. What we rather want to do is have meaningful changes to the behavior by explaining to somebody what your expectation is of them, how their behavior was contrary to that expectation, and why you have that expectation of them. And remember, somebody can't do a don't. So instead of saying don't do that, rather explain to somebody what you do expect them to do. Pointing at documentation, which by the way, very often happens in the employment relationship. Someone will pull out some kind of documentation, point at it and say, well, read here, see this line here, see clause number this, and so forth. This is not a constructive approach. This is a very adversarial, very legalistic approach. So documentation around disciplinary action is necessary when there are specific risks. So the example I gave is the driver, and we want to have a driver policy because if the driver, for example, is in an accident, you want the driver to know what are the steps I need to follow if I'm in an accident. And that is typically information that is helpful for them if it's written down and you've gone over it with them. Documentation should be used to add value to the employment relationship, not to use against each other. Then I also want to caution, don't misunderstand what I'm saying here in terms of saying that most rules do not need to be written down. Don't mistake that there's an assumption that employees know what they're supposed to do. You still need to make employees aware of what behaviors you expect in your business and what behavior is appropriate and what behavior is not appropriate and why. Managers and leaders should be discussing on a regular basis with employees what behavior adds value to the business as a whole and how their behavior impacts on the business. This should be done starting with the onboarding process, but it then needs to continue through the employment relationship. People need to know what is expected of them. This makes for good employment relations, but it is also a legislative requirement if you want to take any disciplinary action. Another point is that high degrees of formalization is not a neutral thing that you implement, meaning it's not just, oh, we have it, but okay, if we don't need it, it's fine. It can have a negative impact on the employment relationship. How the onboarding process is done and when an employee starts with you and the amount of documentation and what that documentation looks like and the information that is provided to them by leadership is going to set the tone for how that employee is going to respond. This means that as soon as the employee starts, some companies might think, oh, we look very sophisticated when we have a lot of documentation in place. But what can often happen is if there's a lot of formalization, remember formalization isn't just documentation, it's what is on those documents and it's how that information is presented to the employee. How that can come across to an employee if they, at the onset of the relationship, see there's a lot of formalization, it will immediately, in most cases, diminish the trust the employee has in the business and they will feel the need to match this level of formalization. I'm going to give you a personal example that's not related to the employment relationship, but a lot of what's relevant to the employment relationship plays out in other relationships. A while ago, I received received a rental contract to sign in order to rent the house that we live in. The contract was incredibly long and very onerous. We're pretty good tenants in my opinion, but this contract made us immediately sort of step back and evaluate whether we wanted to sign this contract and whether this is a good relationship to go into. It seemed incredibly rigid and we were asked to go through it and then come back with any questions or just sign it. So given that this contract was so detailed and so onerous, of course that meant our response to this was to go through it with extreme detail, have a lot of questions and comments to clarify any kind of expectation there was of us given how onerous it is. And we had a lot of suggestions for changes or things that we weren't necessarily comfortable with or wanted clarification on. So because this document was so intense, we matched that and we sent that through then to the realtor. The realtor, seeing that the contract was very onerous, she did warn us when she sent it through, and also our response recommended that we meet with the owner to discuss any of the points because it seemed to her that through the documentation there might be a misperception of the expectations. And once we met the owner and we clarified a lot of points, a lot of that rigidity fell away. But as a result of that documentation, it still meant that we felt the need to be more pedantic than we would typically be with things like our communication with the landlord, because that was the tone that was set. At the onset of the relationship, the trust seemed to be incredibly low. As the relationship has continued, we have come to know that the documentation is not an accurate reflection of the formalization necessary in the relationship, and it also doesn't seem to be what the owner wants in terms of communication from us, because we match the contract with having high formalization from our point, like highly formal emails and so forth, where actually the owner preferred us to send a message or to give a quick call and to have flexibility in how we approach the relationship. So now we've built up a much better trust relationship as the relationship has gone on. So what we want to do is have formalities that cover the important risks, but we don't want them to have a negative impact on the trust relationship. We want to start the relationship with strong expectations of both parties that fosters a good level of trust that we can build on. We want documentation that we can build on, but that is still protective of both the employee and the employer. Another recommendation I have around the documentation in the employment relationship is, earlier in this video I said one of the documents I think is very important to have in all employment relationships is the contract of employment. But an additional step to that, similar with a payslip, I highly recommend that all employers take the time to explain to employees their contract of employment. This is also a service I provided on a regular basis, is I would go in and with groups of employees, I would sit and go through their contract clause by clause, and I would explain to them what it means and why it's in the contract. I would also answer any of the questions they have with a lot of patience, even if the question is repetitive. We want somebody to understand all of the clauses in their contract of employment, not just from a legal perspective, but because it makes for good employment relations. Often things in a contract of employment are written in a specific way by a practitioner because of the experience they've had with the legislation, so they know that a specific clause needs to be detailed in a way that might come across as unusual for an employee, a layman person, reading this documentation. In those cases, you want to ask the professional who drafts the contract to explain it to the person who's signing the contract or to clarify any questions that the employee may have. This is also a service I provide to everybody that I draft contracts of employment for, is that I welcome their employees' questions about the document prior to them signing it, and I'm willing to, on email or through a meeting, to clarify anything that's in there and to discuss it with the employees. But a good thing to have is a leader should also understand all the clauses and why they are in there. So a leader should be able to explain this to an employee, but sometimes it is effective and it builds trust when an employer gets the employment relations practitioner to do that, given that they are the person who drafted the contract. Two final points I'd like to discuss before I close off this video. One of them features very often, and that is job descriptions. Should you have job descriptions? The answer is yes and no, or more accurately, it depends. Realistically, many businesses do not have job descriptions because the job that the employee is doing is a job where the employee very clearly understands what falls into their job description. I think it is a document that is good to have. And also in terms of the basic conditions of Employment Act, the employee does need to have a brief description of the work for which they are employed to do and also their occupational title. But this doesn't translate to the legislation saying there needs to be job description descriptions. I think that a brief job description in most businesses is something that's helpful, but what you need to clarify when giving an employee a job description is that they may be required to do things that fall outside of that job description, and that is a reasonable expectation as long as what is being asked of them to do is appropriate given their level of skill, and what you're asking them to do is, of course, legal and reasonable. And the final point is around policies. I recommend them in some situations to mitigate specific risks in the company. The larger the business is and the more complexities a business has, the more policies they will need to have in place. Another recommendation I have around policies, and it may be my personal opinion that they don't add value to the employment relationship, but they're a legislative requirement and therefore I recommend that businesses have them in place. So an example of this is depending on the size of your business and the industry you're in and the type of work that gets done, there may be a legislative requirement for specific policies. Examples of this includes having an employment equity policy and a health and safety policy. I definitely do not recommend having a long library full of policies that nobody's reading and nobody's implementing. Documentation is only valuable if it is accurately reflecting what's happening in the employment relationship and contributes to ensuring that the parties know what is expected of each other and clarifies any misunderstandings or potential misunderstandings that may arise from the employment relationship. Documentation for documentation's sake is not valuable and is also in most cases, like I've explained in this video, not a neutral act. And with that, I'm going to end off today's video. If you have any questions, let me know in the comments down below. If you like this video, please like this video and subscribe to my channel if you like my content. If there are specific elements of the employment relationship that you would like me to discuss, please leave that down in the comments below. And I do make the videos that people request because this video was requested through a comment on my YouTube channel. Thank you so much for watching.